The world did not begin with a bang for Dante Vane. It began with a suffocating, velvet silence. Dante sat at the head of a mahogany table that cost more than a suburban home, surrounded by the 12 most dangerous men in the tri-state area. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the city was a sprawling electric hive of neon blues and burning oranges. But to Dante, it was a charcoal sketch, a smudge of grey on a canvas of nothing. He watched the mouth of his underboss, Rico, move in a frantic, jagged rhythm. Rico was pleading for his life, sweating through a $4,000 silk suit. Dante could see the perspiration beading on the man's forehead, but he couldn't see the fear. He couldn't feel the heat in the room. Even the glass of scotch in Dante's hand, a vintage that should have tasted like peat and ancient sunlight, slid down his throat like lukewarm water. Dante Vane was the silent sovereign, a man who ruled an empire of noise while living in a tomb of sensory deprivation. 10 years ago, a rival's neurotoxin hadn't killed him. It had simply turned off the lights. He suffered from a psychological and physical grey out. The music was just a vibration. The food was just texture. Power was just a mathematical equation he solved daily to keep from disappearing entirely. He was a ghost haunting his own throne, a predator who had forgotten the scent of blood. "Boss!" Rico's voice finally punctured the static, thin and tinny. "The shipment. It's gone. The Irish intercepted it at the pier. I didn't have enough men." Dante didn't blink. He didn't reach for the suppressed pistol resting by his saucer. He simply looked at Rico. In Dante's mind, he was looking through him. He was searching for a spark, a flicker of anger, a surge of adrenaline, anything to let him know he was still alive. Nothing. Just the dull, rhythmic thrum of his own heart, sounding like a distant drum underwater. "Rico," Dante said. His own voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger 3 rooms away. "Do you know what the color red looks like?" Rico froze, his eyes darting to the other capos. "Sir?" "I've forgotten," Dante whispered, more to himself than the room. "I see a smudge where the blood should be. I hear a hum where the screams should be. You've failed me. But I can't even find the energy to hate you for it." The terror in the room thickened until it was palpable to everyone but the man at the head of the table. Dante stood up. He was 6'4" with a tailored shadow. He didn't give the order to execute Rico. He didn't have to. The silence he left behind was a death sentence in itself. He walked out of the boardroom, his footsteps making no sound on the plush carpet. His security detail fell into formation behind him. 6 men in black, moving like a well-oiled machine. They descended to the garage, where a custom armored limousine waited. "Drive," Dante commanded. "Where to, Mr. Vane?" the driver asked, his voice trembling. "Nowhere. Anywhere. Somewhere with enough noise to drown out the nothing." They drove for hours through the rain-slicked streets of the coastal district. The raindrops hitting the windshield looked like grey static on a broken television screen. Dante leaned his head against the cold glass. He felt the vibration, but not the cold. He was a king of a monochrome wasteland, yearning for a single jagged edge to cut through the silk wrap of his existence. Then, the car swerved. A neon sign flickered through the fog, pulsing with a weird, rhythmic glitch that caught Dante's deadened eyes. The Pier Diner. It was a rusted, salt-crusted relic of a building hanging over the black Atlantic. It looked pathetic. It looked loud. It looked like the last place on Earth a Mafia boss should be. "Stop here," Dante said. He stepped out into the rain, his men flanking him like shadows. He pushed open the heavy glass door, the bell above it chiming a flat, tinny note. The smell of burnt coffee and grease hit the air, but to Dante, it was just more grey. He sat at the counter, a shark in a goldfish pond. Then he saw her. She wasn't looking at his suit. She wasn't looking at his guards. She was slamming a tray of dirty mugs onto the counter, her shoulders shaking with a fury that seemed to radiate a heat Dante could almost perceive. Dante didn't know it yet, but the grey was about to shatter. The smell of burnt grease and cheap floor cleaner usually acted as Maya's anchor, but tonight it felt like a noose. The diner was a skeleton of a place, clinging to the edge of the Atlantic pier, while the salt air gnawed at its bones. Maya wiped the counter for the 1,000th time, her movements mechanical. Her hands were raw, cracked from double shifts and the biting coastal wind. Underneath the fluorescent hum of the diner, her mind was elsewhere. Stuck in a hospital room 3 weeks ago, watching the light leave her father's eyes because they couldn't afford the very medicine the men in suits uptown controlled. She was hollow. She was exhausted. And then the door opened. The atmosphere didn't just change, it died. 6 men in charcoal overcoats fanned out like a tactical unit, through their eyes scanning the grease-stained booths with predatory precision. In the center walked a man who didn't belong in reality. Dante Vane looked like he had been carved out of obsidian, sharp, cold, and devastatingly still. He sat at the counter, ignoring the section closed sign, and stared at the chipped formica as if it were a digital readout. "Coffee!" one of his guards barked. "Black. Now." Maya didn't move immediately. She felt a surge of heat behind her eyes, a primal, jagged resentment. These were the men who owned the city's shadows. These were the men who played God, while people like her father became statistics. "The machine is cleaning," Maya said, her voice raspy but firm. "It'll be 10 minutes. The guard stepped forward, his hand drifting toward the silhouette of a holster under his jacket. "You don't make him wait. Do you have any idea who—" "I don't care if he's the Pope," Maya snapped, her grief finally curdling into a reckless, white-hot bravery. She slammed a stack of menus onto the counter, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent diner. "He can wait 10 minutes like everyone else, or he can walk back out into the rain." The air in the room vanished. The guards moved in unison, a wall of lethal intent closing in on her. But Dante Vane didn't move. He didn't even look up. He was staring at her hands, specifically the way they were trembling with a fury that defied his status. To Dante, the world was still a silent, to grey photograph. But as Maya spoke, he felt a strange, microscopic thrum in the base of his skull. Her voice wasn't just noise. It had a texture he hadn't felt in a decade. It was like a jagged needle scraping against a numb limb. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You're loud," he whispered. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation of a scientific anomaly. "And you're a parasite," Maya retorted, the words spilling out before her brain could catch them. "You sit there in a suit that costs more than this entire pier, acting like the world is your footstool. You think your silence is power? It's just cowardice. You're just a ghost hiding behind a paycheck." One of the guards grabbed Maya's wrist, twisting it. "That's enough, girl." "Let her go," Dante said. His voice was a low, terrifying vibration. The guard hesitated, then released her. Maya stumbled back, her hip hitting a tray of heavy ceramic mugs. They crashed to the floor, shattering into a million white shards. Dante looked at the mess, then back at her. A smirk, thin, cruel, and utterly devoid of life, touched his lips. "Clumsy," Just like your father, I imagine. Weak people always break things they can't fix. Maya didn't think. The mention of her father, the exhaustion, and the sheer arrogance of the man before her snapped the last thread of her restraint. She lunged across the counter. Crack! The sound of her palm meeting Dante's cheek was the loudest thing to ever happen in that diner. It wasn't a clip or a graze. It was a full weight, bone-deep strike that sent his head snapping to the side. The guards drew their weapons, the metallic shick-shick of chambering rounds filling the air. Maya stood her ground, chest heaving, waiting for the bullet. But Dante Vane was frozen. Slowly he turned his face back toward her. A bright, crimson welt was blossoming across his pale skin. For the first time in 10 years, Dante wasn't seeing grey. He was seeing red. Violent, beautiful, searing red. And he wasn't just seeing it. He was feeling a stinging electric heat that made his heart, which had been a dormant stone, kick against his ribs like a trapped bird. The guards looked at Dante, waiting for the signal to kill her. Dante looked at Maya, his pupils dilating until his eyes were nothing but bottomless black pits. "Wait," Dante whispered, his hand trembling as he touched his own burning cheek. I can feel that." He looked at Maya, not with rage, but with a terrifying, starving hunger. The silence that followed the slap wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It was the sound of a universe holding its breath before an explosion. 6 semi-automatic pistols cleared their holsters in a synchronized metallic snarl. The red laser dots danced across Maya's chest, centering over her heart like glowing parasitic insects. The guards didn't wait for an order. In their world, a hand laid on the sovereign was a death warrant signed in real time. Maya didn't flinch. The adrenaline had turned her blood into liquid fire, masking the terror that should have been paralyzing her. She stared into the abyss of Dante Vane's eyes, her hand still stinging from the impact. "Kill her!" the lead guard, Luca, hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Wait." The word didn't come from Dante's mouth so much as it bled from his soul. It was a fractured, rasping sound. Dante didn't look at his men. He didn't look at the guns. He was shivering, a violent, rhythmic tremor that started in his knees and traveled up his spine. For the first time in a decade, the grey fog in his peripheral vision was receding. The dull, charcoal world was being scorched away by a localized sun centered exactly where Maya's palm had met his cheek. It wasn't just pain. It was a presence. It was the jagged, glorious reality of being alive. Dante slowly raised his hand. It wasn't the gesture of a king commanding his court. It was the reach of a drowning man grasping for a ledge. "Lower. The weapons," Dante commanded. His voice was gaining strength, vibrating with a frequency that made the coffee cups on the counter rattle. "Boss, she assaulted you," Luca protested, his face a mask of confusion. "She's a nobody. We have to—" "I said lower them," Dante roared. The outburst was like a physical shockwave. The guards, seasoned killers who had seen Dante execute men without blinking, recoiled. They had never heard him shout. They had never seen him feel. They holstered their weapons, their eyes darting between the waitress and their shaking leader. Dante leaned forward, his face inches from Maya's. The neon sign outside the window flickered. Red, blue, red, blue. And for the first time, Dante didn't see shades of ash. He saw the deep, mahogany warmth of Maya's irises. He saw the golden flecks of defiance swimming in her tears. He saw the way her pupils flared with a mixture of hatred and soul-deep exhaustion. "Brown," Dante whispered, his voice thick with a terrifying awe. Your eyes. They're brown. Maya recoiled, her lip curling in disgust. Is that a joke? Are you going to kill me or not, you psychopath? Dante didn't answer. He was too busy cataloguing the sensations. The air in the diner suddenly smelled of ozone and old rain. The humming of the refrigerator was no longer a dull drone. It was a sharp, electric chord. The welt on his face was throbbing, a rhythmic thump-thump that synced perfectly with the heartbeat he hadn't noticed in years. He reached out, his gloved fingers hovering just an inch from the counter where her hand rested. He wanted to see if the contact would bring more color, more sound, more life. Maya pulled her hand away, as if his very presence was toxic. Don't touch me. Get your coffee and get out. I don't care who you are. I'm done with today. I'm done with all of you. Dante stood up slowly. The silent sovereign was gone. In his place stood a man who looked like he had just been electrocuted back into his own skin. He looked at his men, then back at the waitress, who had just shattered his decade-long prison. We're leaving, Dante said. Boss? Luca asked, stepping forward. Dante turned to him, and the look in his eyes was so predatory, so intensely focused, that Luca took a step back. Nobody touches her. Nobody comes near this place unless I am with them. If she loses a single hair, I will burn this city until there is nothing left but the salt. He walked toward the door, his movements no longer mechanical, but fluid and dangerous. As he pushed the door open, the bell chimed, a clear, crystalline silver sound that made him wince in beautiful, agonizing detail. Outside, in the black limousine, Dante didn't lean back. He stared at his reflection in the tinted glass, watching the red bruise on his face begin to darken. Luca, Dante said into the darkness of the car. Yes, sir? Find out everything. Her name, her father, the air she breathes. And Luca. Get me a list of everyone she owes money to. Dante touched the bruise again, a ghost of a smile haunting his lips. The world was loud, colourful, and violent again. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would do anything to keep the grey from coming back. In the diner, Maya stood among the shattered porcelain, her heart finally slowing down. She reached for the broom, but her eyes were fixed on the black car disappearing into the fog. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze. The bell on the door hadn't finished ringing before a black SUV pulled into the lot, its headlights off. The underworld of the coast didn't run on money. It ran on a very specific type of silence. When Dante Vane, the man who had ordered executions over a misplaced comma, began appearing at the pier diner every night at 2 a.m., the silence of the city turned into a deafening roar of speculation. The rumours spread through the shipping docks and the high-rise penthouses like a virus. The sovereign has lost his mind. He's gone soft. He's obsessed. But inside the diner, the reality was far more predatory. Dante didn't come with flowers, and he didn't come with apologies. He came with his six-man shadow and sat in the same cracked vinyl booth, his eyes fixed on Maya with the unblinking intensity of a man watching a miracle or a car crash. He was waiting. Maya felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure against her spine. Every time she turned around, there he was, a monolith of dark wool and cold intentions. He never ordered food. He only ordered black coffee, which he let go cold until a thin, oily film formed on the surface. He didn't speak a single word to her. He just sat there, soaking in the sound of her footsteps, the clatter of her silverware, and the sharp, jagged rhythm of her breathing. To Dante, the diner was a sensory cathedral. The smell of old mop water was a symphony. The flickering neon light was a strobe show of pure, uncut reality. But the center of it all was Maya. When she was near, the grey fog stayed at bay. When she snapped at a customer or slammed a cabinet, the noise of her life acted like a defibrillator to his dying nervous system. He wasn't stalking a woman. He was haunting a source of light. "You're killing my business," Maya finally hissed on the fourth night, leaning over the counter, her face inches from his. "Look at the windows, Dante. There are lookouts in the parking lot. There are snipers on the pier. Nobody wants to buy grilled cheese in a war zone." Dante looked up. The bruise on his cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, and he felt a desperate, hollow ache for the sharp red sting to return. "Then close the doors," he said, his voice like grinding stones. "I'll pay for the night. I'll pay for the year. Just keep moving. Keep talking." "I am not your entertainment," Maya's voice cracked. Her eyes were rimmed with red, grief and exhaustion finally winning the war. "My father died because men like you decided his neighborhood was a growth opportunity. I don't want your blood money, and I don't want your shadow. Why won't you just kill me and get it over with?" The guards shifted, their hands twitching toward their jackets. Dante raised a single finger, and they went still as statues. "I don't want to kill you, Maya," Dante whispered, leaning in until he could smell the salt on her skin. "I want you to make me feel something else." The slap was a beginning, but the pain is already fading. I'm starting to go grey again. The edges of the room are blurring. Maya stared at him, her anger flickering into a brief, terrifying moment of pity. She saw the madness in his eyes, but she also saw the starvation. He was a billionaire, a king, a butcher, and he was begging a waitress for the crumbs of her humanity. "You're a sick man," she whispered, pulling back. "I am a dead man," he corrected. "And you are the only thing that keeps the dirt from settling over my eyes." Outside, the city was vibrating. In the dark, SUVs parked across the street. Dante's lieutenants were watching through thermal scopes. They didn't see a man finding his soul. They saw a king vacating his throne for a girl who smelled of cheap soap and desperation. The Syndicate of Shadows was built on the myth of Dante's invincibility. Every second he sat in that booth was a second that myth eroded. As Dante watched Maya walk away to the back of the kitchen, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A small, black envelope tucked under the sugar dispenser of a nearby table. It wasn't his. It wasn't the diner's. It was addressed to Maya, sealed with a wax stamp of a headless crow, the mark of his own internal security. The storm outside the pier diner wasn't just rain. It was a physical assault of salt and iron-grey water. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic presence of Dante Vane. Maya stood at the far end of the counter, her fingers trembling as she gripped a glass carafe. She had seen the black envelope Dante had discovered, the one with the headless crow. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew the way Dante's men looked at her, like she was a glitch in a system that was built to delete errors. She walked toward his booth, her boots clicking on the linoleum. Every step felt like a drumbeat in a death march. She didn't pour the coffee. She sat down opposite him, breaking the unspoken rule of their strange nightly dance. "What is wrong with you?" she asked, her voice low and stripped of its usual bite. "You sit here like a statue. You watch me like I'm a ghost. You let me hit you." "Why?" Dante looked at her. In the harsh, flickering light of the diner, his face seemed less like a mask of power and more like a crumbling monument. The grey was encroaching again. The edges of Maya's silhouette were beginning to fray into the ash-coloured void of his neuralgia. "I grew up in a room with no windows," Dante said. His voice was a hollow echo of the man who ruled the city. My father was a man of logic and steel. He taught me that feelings were static, interference in a clear signal. He raised me to be a machine. And then, 10 years ago, a toxin finished what he started. It turned the world into a silent film. He reached out, his hand hovering over the table, not touching but seeking. I haven't felt the warmth of a sun on my skin in a decade, Maya. I haven't tasted the bitterness of coffee or the sting of a cold wind. Everything is nothing. Maya watched him. She looked for the monster, the man whose organization had crushed her neighborhood under the weight of development. But she didn't see a predator. She saw a boy who had been locked in a sensory deprivation tank for half his life. He wasn't here to hurt her. He was here because she was the only thing loud enough, angry enough, and real enough to break through the glass wall of his existence. "You're a junkie," she whispered, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. "You're not obsessed with me. You're obsessed with the pain I caused you. You're using my grief to feel alive." Dante's eyes flickered. A flash of genuine, agonizing shame crossed his face, a human expression that looked entirely foreign on his features. "Yes," he admitted. The slap. It was the first time the world turned red. It was the first time I heard the sound of my own heart. I am a starving man, and you are a feast of fire. Maya felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to hate him. She had every right to. But looking at the silent sovereign now, she saw the terrifying loneliness of a man who owned everything but possessed nothing. He was a king of ashes, sitting in a plastic booth, begging for a moment of clarity. She reached across the table. Her hand, small and calloused, covered his cold, pale one. Dante let out a breath that sounded like a sob, though his face remained a disciplined mask. To him, the touch was like a bolt of lightning. The color flooded back into the room, the yellow of the mustard bottles, the deep blue of Maya's apron, the golden brown of her skin. The world vibrated with the sudden, violent return of sound. "It's not enough to just feel pain, Dante," Maya said softly, her thumb brushing his knuckles. "You can't build a life on slaps and anger." "That's all I have," he whispered. "Then you're poorer than I am." Dante looked down at their joined hands. For a moment, the Mafia boss vanished, and the lonely boy in the windowless room took his place. But the moment was shattered by the sharp clack of a ceramic mug breaking in the kitchen. Dante's lead guard, Luca, was standing by the swinging doors, his face a mask of cold fury. He wasn't looking at Maya. He was looking at Dante's hand, at the weakness of the sovereign. He touched the radio on his shoulder and whispered a single word. "Initiate." Maya saw the shift in the air before she heard the engines. The transition from peace to violence didn't happen with a shout. It happened with the cold, rhythmic clicking of safety catches being disengaged. Dante was still lost in the sensation of Maya's hand on his, a moment of tactile grace that felt like a lifetime, when the diner's front windows exploded. Great crystalline sheets of glass rained down like diamonds, shattered by a concussion grenade that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Dante's world didn't go grey, it went white. The high-pitched ring of the blast tore through his neural pathways, a jagged blade of sound that sent him collapsing to the floor. His condition, usually a cage of silence, had become a conductor for the chaos. "Secure the distraction!" Luca's voice boomed, stripped of its former subservience. Maya tried to scream, but a heavy, gloved hand clamped over her mouth. She was hoisted over the shoulder of a man she recognized, one of the shadows who had stood guard while Dante watched her. She thrashed, her heels drumming against his tactical vest. But these men were machines of efficiency. They didn't see a woman. They saw a biological error that needed to be purged to save their king. "Don't touch her." Dante gasped from the floor. He tried to rise, his fingers clawing at the linoleum, but his nervous system was backfiring. Without the anchor of Maya's touch, or the direct impact of her defiance, the sensory neuralgia was flooding back like a tide of liquid lead. His vision began to fray at the edges, the vibrant colors of the diner, the yellow mustard, the red blood on his hand, dissolving into a muddy, suffocating ash. "You'll thank us later, boss," Luca said, looking down at his leader with a mixture of pity and contempt. "The syndicate doesn't follow a man who kneels for a waitress. We're taking her to the foundry. By morning, you'll be the sovereign again." The back door of the diner kicked open. A black van, its engine idling with a low, predatory growl, waited in the rain. Maya was tossed inside like a sack of grain. She caught one last glimpse of Dante, the most feared man in the city, reduced to a shivering ghost on a dirty floor, reaching into the empty air for a hand that was no longer there. The van roared to life, tires screaming against the wet asphalt as it peeled away from the pier. Dante lay in the wreckage of his sanctuary. The silence was returning. The world was becoming a flat, silent photograph once more. But as the darkness closed in, he felt something cold pressed against his palm. So he looked down. It was a shard of the broken coffee mug. It was sharp. It was jagged. And as he squeezed his fist shut, the sudden white-hot bite of the porcelain cutting into his skin brought one singular crystalline image back into focus. The direction the van had turned. The syndicate thought they were fixing a machine. They didn't realize they had just given a monster a reason to burn the world down. The foundry was a cathedral of rusting iron and screaming machinery, a place where the syndicate's mistakes went to vanish. Maya was bound to a steel chair in the center of the kill floor, the cold dampness of the warehouse seeping into her bones. Luca stood over her, checking the weight of a silenced pistol. He didn't hate her. He simply viewed her as a broken gear in a multi-billion-dollar clock. "He's coming," Maya whispered, her voice cracking. "And he's not going to just kill you. He's going to erase you." Luca laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "He can't even see the color of your hair without help, girl. He's not a man anymore. He's a glitch." Suddenly, the heavy steel doors of the foundry didn't just open. They were vaporized. A black SUV slammed through the entrance at 60 miles per hour, flipping over a forklift before screeching to a halt in a cloud of steam and debris. Dante Vane stepped out of the wreckage. He looked like a nightmare birthed from a storm. His hand was wrapped in a bloody rag, the shard of porcelain still tucked into his palm to keep the world in focus. But as he stepped into the searing white glare of the warehouse floodlights, the sensory overload hit him like a physical wall. The grey didn't just return. It mutated. The white lights bleached into a blinding, featureless void. The roar of the machines flattened into a soul-crushing hum. Dante swung his weapon toward a guard, but the man's silhouette dissolved into a smoky smudge. His legs felt like they were made of cotton. His skin felt like it was encased in a mile of lead. He was fighting in a tomb. "He's blind!" one of the guards shouted, realizing Dante was firing at shadows. "The sovereign is broken. Finish him!" Dante took a bullet to the shoulder. He didn't feel the pain. That was the problem. He didn't know he was bleeding. He only felt the sudden, clumsy lurch of his arm. He was a god-tier predator, suddenly stripped of his eyes and ears in the middle of a wolf pack. Luca stepped out from behind a pillar, aiming directly at Dante's head. Goodbye, boss, Luca sneered. Maya saw the hammer cock back. She saw Dante standing there, a tragic, powerful figure staring into a vacancy she couldn't see, his eyes wide and vacant. She realized he wasn't looking for the enemy. He was looking for her. He was lost in the dark, and she was the only map he had ever known. She didn't scream for help. She didn't scream in terror. She screamed his name with every ounce of grief, rage, and strange, budding hope she had left in her heart. Dante! The sound tore through the foundry. To anyone else, it was just a woman's cry. To Dante Vane, it was a physical reconstruction of the universe. The frequency of her voice, the specific, jagged vibration of her vocal cords, shattered the grey veil like a hammer through a mirror. In a hyperkinetic burst, the world slammed back into high definition. He saw the glint of the brass casing in Luca's gun. He saw the bead of sweat on the gunman's lip. He saw the exact shade of crimson blooming on Maya's bound wrists. Dante moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a force of nature. In the 3 seconds it took Luca to blink, Dante had closed the gap. He didn't use his gun. He used his hands. He moved with a terrifying, fluid precision that was only possible for someone who had spent a decade memorizing the geometry of the dark. He dismantled the guards with a cold, surgical brutality that made the machines of the foundry seem merciful. When he finally reached Luca, he didn't pull the trigger. He leaned in, his eyes burning with a terrifying technicolor fire. "I can hear your heart," Dante whispered. "It sounds like a coward's drum." He turned toward Maya, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The world was still vibrating, held together only by the echo of her voice. He reached for the ropes, but as his fingers touched her skin, he froze. A red light was blinking on a crate behind her. Not a sensor, a timer. The red timer didn't tick. It hummed, a digital pulse that felt like a needle stitching Dante's nerves back together. 0014. 0013. The syndicate hadn't just come to clean up a distraction. They had rigged the foundry to be Dante Vane's funeral pyre. High above in the rafters, a hidden camera lens glinted. The board of directors was watching. They were waiting to see their king burn so they could inherit the ashes. "Go!" Maya choked out, her eyes wide as she stared at the bricks of C4 strapped to the pillar behind her. "Dante, you can make it to the door. Move." Dante didn't move toward the exit. He moved toward her. The sensory flood was overwhelming. For the first time, he could smell the copper of his own blood and the scorched scent of the wiring. He looked at Maya, and in the shadow of death, he saw the only truth he had ever found in a life of lies. If he saved her and stayed the sovereign, the syndicate would hunt her to the ends of the earth. She would be a permanent leverage point, a target, a casualty of his shadow. To save her life, he had to kill the man he was. "Close your eyes," Dante whispered. It wasn't a request. It was a prayer. With a strength born of desperation, he ripped the steel chair from its floor bolts. He didn't try to defuse the bomb. There was no time. Instead, he threw his heavy, Kevlar-lined overcoat over Maya and shielded her body with his own, wedging them both into a narrow, reinforced industrial cooling trench beneath the floorboards. 0003. "Dante, what are you doing?" she cried against his chest. "Dante Vane dies tonight," he murmured into her hair. Tell them the ghost finally found his grave." He reached up and fired his weapon not at the guards, but at the overhead gas line, 001. The world turned into a sun. The explosion was a physical fist that flattened the foundry. From the outside, the building erupted in a spectacular blossom of orange and black, sending a shockwave across the pier that shattered the windows of every car for 3 blocks. To the syndicate watching through the remote feed, the screen went to static the moment the fire swallowed the center of the room. There were no survivors. No one could have lived through that heat. Inside the trench, the world was a roaring furnace. Dante felt the searing heat lick at his back, the agony so intense it bypassed his neuralgia and scorched his very soul. He welcomed it. The pain was the last tether to his old life. He held Maya so tightly he could feel her heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, living rhythm that kept him from slipping back into the grey. Hours later, as the rain began to hiss against the glowing embers of the ruin, 2 figures crawled from the smoking earth. Dante looked at his hands. They were charred, trembling, and empty of the rings that signaled his power. He looked at the city skyline, the towers he used to own, the streets he used to rule. To the world, the sovereign was a pile of carbon in a warehouse. "They'll be looking for your body," Maya whispered, her voice a ghost in the wind. She was covered in soot, her clothes rags, but she was alive. "They won't find it," Dante said. His voice was different now, lighter, yet hollowed out. "They'll find the dental records I planted in the guard's body near the blast. They'll find the ashes of a king." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted drive he had snatched from Luca's belt before the explosion. It contained the offshore accounts, the blackmails, and the structural weaknesses of every syndicate member. He wasn't just leaving. He was leaving a ticking time bomb in their bank accounts. "Where do we go?" Maya asked. Dante looked at her. For the first time, he didn't need a slap to see the color of her eyes. The fire had etched them into his memory. But as he looked down at the drive in his hand, he saw a final message flashing on the small LED screen. "Internal GPS triggered. Location sent to secondary cleanup crew." Dante's blood ran cold. The syndicate didn't believe in accidents. The Mediterranean sun was a brutal, honest gold, the kind of light that didn't just illuminate a room, but interrogated it. 5 years had passed since the night the silent sovereign died in a warehouse fire. In a small coastal village in Amalfi, far from the neon-choked skyscrapers and the blood-soaked piers, a man sat at a wrought-iron table overlooking the sea. He wore a simple linen shirt, his skin bronzed by a sun he could finally feel. His hands, once used to sign death warrants, were now stained with the soil of the lemon grove behind the cottage. Dante Vane was a ghost, a myth whispered by the syndicate members who had survived the systematic, anonymous dismantling of their bank accounts. He was a nobody now, a man without a title, a man whose only currency was the quiet rhythm of the waves. But there was a problem. The grey was lurking. Lately, the silence had begun to feel a little too heavy. The lemons didn't taste as sharp. The blue of the sea looked a little more like slate. Dante felt the familiar, terrifying numbness creeping back into his fingertips. The neurological cage was trying to lock its doors again. He sat staring at a cup of espresso, his face a mask of mounting frustration. "This coffee is garbage," Dante muttered, his voice echoing with a ghost of his old, commanding chill. Maya stepped out from the cottage, wiping her hands on an apron that smelled of lavender and sea salt. She didn't look like a weary waitress anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally stopped looking over her shoulder. She stopped, tilting her head as she watched him. She knew that look. She knew the way his eyes started to wander toward the horizon when the world began to fade for him. "It's the same bean we've used for 3 years, Dante," she said softly. "It tastes like ash," he snapped, his jaw tightening. The water is flat. The heat is gone. Maybe we should move. Maybe this place is too quiet. I can't hear the birds anymore, Maya. It's all becoming a photograph again. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the stone tiles. The old shadow of the Mafia boss flickered in his posture. The restless, dangerous energy of a man who felt the walls closing in. He looked at her, and for a terrifying second, his eyes were as vacant as the day they met at the pier. "Fix it," he demanded, a spark of the old arrogance returning to his voice. "Fix the coffee, or I'm going for a drive. I need something real. I need a reason to stay awake." Maya didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She walked right up to him, her shadow merging with his on the sun-baked stone. She looked into those fading eyes, the eyes of the man who had burned an empire to keep her safe. She didn't offer a hug. She didn't offer a kiss. Crack! The slap was thunderous. It echoed off the cliffside and startled the gulls into the air. Dante's head snapped to the side, his cheek instantly blooming into a vivid, electric crimson. The world didn't just return, it exploded. The scent of the lemons became a riot in his lungs. The sound of the waves turned from a hum into a roar. Dante gasped, his hand flying to his face, his fingers tracing the heat of her palm. He looked at Maya, and the grey was gone. She was there, vibrant, sharp, and more beautiful than any sunset. Dante didn't growl. He didn't reach for a weapon. He let out a low, a shaky laugh that turned into a genuine, soul-deep smile. He pulled her into his chest, burying his face in her neck, breathing in the reality of her. "Better?" she whispered into his ear, her hand lingering on his burning cheek. "Perfect," Dante breathed. He was a man who had owned the world and hated it. Now, he owned nothing but a stinging cheek and a woman who wasn't afraid to break him back into being human. They were finally free, not because the danger was gone, but because they had found a way to fight the silence together. As they sat back down to share the garbage coffee, a small black boat appeared on the horizon, moving toward the private cove. Dante didn't reach for a gun. He just took Maya's hand and squeezed it, feeling every single beat of her heart.